Okay, perfect. So, icebreaker question. Could you give us a quick overview of how you ended up in UX? So I'm not sure who would like to go first. Rachel's at the top of my screen. So Rachel, would you like to go first with the icebreaker?
Sure. And I will give a heads up that I have a very lively 2-year-old downstairs, so hopefully it's not too distracting, but he likes to yell and play very loudly. So, okay, so thanks for having me here first off. Very excited to chat with all of you today. So my career path was very kind of winding and non-traditional. I actually started out, I was a professional ballet dancer for most of my life. Started dancing at age 5 and then up through my late 20s, and I decided to go back to school. And so I was in between kind of ballet seasons, and I decided to go back to school. And then I started and I was like, oh wow, I really love this. I'm gonna keep doing this. So I kind of started my academic journey late, but I always had this like love for both sides of my brain, I guess, which was like the very like creative and kind of designy things, and then also balanced with this like logical organizational side. So coming out of dancing, I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I knew that those were two strengths of mine. So I did business undergrad, and then from there I didn't want to go into like a traditional business path, which was all my peers were in accounting and finance and consulting, etc. I knew I wanted to apply kind of like my business knowledge to a creative field. So I ended up taking a role in an architecture firm, and I was in an innovation studio there. So it was very kind of a weird place, but we were like designing new services and products for the built environment. So I did big research projects and worked with all kinds of different designers, and I was introduced to this cool new thing at that time, which was design thinking. And I was really excited by it. Hadn't heard of anything like it before. And so I ended up deciding to go back to school and getting an MBA in design strategy, which was like this perfect combination of blending my love for design and business into one thing. And then from there, I found out about this role at Adaptive Path. At that time, Kristen Skinner, who wrote the book Org Design for Design Orgs, was kicking off, like heading up a new practice at Capital One. So Adaptive Path had just gotten acquired by Capital One, and it was at that time called Design Management. So I was one of the first people she hired to, I see Tim Gilligan on the call too. He also was on my team. Hi, Tim. So we were kind of, it was this new space of what is now I would call design operations, but at that time it was design management. And we were kind of doing two parts. One was working with our design teams, and the other part was like defining what is this thing? Like, what is design management? How do we do it in this large organization? And so that's kind of how I ended up there. It was mostly about like finding a role that balanced these two things that I loved, which was the design and then the business side, or these two kind of sides of my brain. And then I kind of fell into this kind of design ops role, which has evolved since I started. It's been kind of changed course a lot, which I love, but we can talk more about that later. That's kind of my journey to where I am now.
That's so interesting. Thank you. It's really like varied as well, like quite a squiggly career path. That's awesome. Lindsay, do you want to answer the same question?
I'm happy to do so. And I also are seeing some friendly faces on the line too that I've worked with in past lives. So it's so nice to see you all again, and for new friends as well. Thank you all for joining. Rachel, it's funny because I relate so much to your story about this sort of like serendipitous journey into design. I likewise in university studied in psychology. Wasn't one of those kids like my fellow classmates who knew what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they were studying computer science and they were doing pre-med classes. I got my degree in psychology and left there and actually ended up going back into junior college, ironically enough, for about 3 years, thinking that I wanted to do pre-med into sports med. And then, .com happened, ended up in various started and failed startups in around the early 2000s with the original .com boom. That took me into a strange path into financial services and account management and client services roles. And then while working in a company called Reuters, got exposure to design consultancy world, which at the time I didn't even realize that design was a career that you could pursue. I didn't know any designers at the time, other than a couple of folks that I worked with at Thomson. And that sort of led into this product management role, which I probably had no business doing, to be honest, which led me to working with Frog Design. And they had been redesigning one of our platforms that I was the product manager for. And then they had a role open for a program manager, which, to be honest, at the time I thought was the same thing as a product manager role. I had no idea what the differentiation was between the two. But when I first interviewed at Frog, I realized that I had come into the space that felt very different from anything that I had worked in before. Just being in a creative space, seeing work up on walls, getting a peek behind the scenes at like how the creative process unfolds was very new to me. And I just found it all so fascinating. And I think from there, I sort of realized that I had found my tribe, that I wanted to continue to work with design and creative professionals. It's kind of been from there, between lots of consulting roles, gosh, almost 8 years working at Frog, another few years working at Fjord post acquisition by Accenture. And then from there, dovetailing back into in-house roles and starting up a design operations practice at Uber, subsequently to Dropbox, and now on to Apple.
Great, thank you. It was really good to get all that background. So we'll go into the first of a few themes that we've got to talk about today. So I think the first is probably one that I guess many people maybe have the question around, which is, what actually is design operations? I wonder if you could both talk about it, maybe in your own words, what it is day to day and how it actually works. Maybe Lindsay, you can go first on this one.
Sure. I feel like I spend a lot of my days answering this question, and it's ever evolving, is what I would say. I don't know if Rachel, you feel similarly. The number of times that I feel like I have to explain now, what is it that you do again, is a pretty common theme throughout many of my days and through my professional journey as well. The way that I think about design operations is really as being kind of the glue to a design team. So oftentimes people who are in design ops roles, particularly for larger organizations as they continue to scale, it can feel like you're kind of the heart and soul of the team. And some of that is the programs that people in that function are also building that tend to be a lot of sort of community-based programs, a lot of engagement type programs, learning programs, onboarding programs. And so sometimes the design ops folks that are in a team are oftentimes the first people that new hires meet in their journey of working in a design organization. And that carries throughout their entire employee experience. What would you say, Rachel?
Yeah, definitely all of that. So the way that I think about design operations, like just very like in the simplest terms, is that like we're designing the how, so design can focus on the what. So we're focusing on the how, so design can focus on the what. And I do really think about design ops as designers. We're just designing systems and processes and programs and tools for designers. So they are our users, or oftentimes designers, it's beyond designers who are our users. But I use the same approach in a lot of ways that designers use to like solve operational problems. So we do basically whatever the design team needs. Like the work we do looks so different depending on who is, which design ops person is, doing it, or which team you're on, because the needs are different on every design team, depending on the maturity of the design team you're working with, or what level of Zoom you're operating at. Like the needs are different, but the kind of baseline work that we're all doing is about operationalizing, optimizing, and scaling the effectiveness of design.
Awesome, that's great, thank you. So maybe it would be quite nice to just talk about like a day in the life. Like, what is your sort of day, like a normal day for you both look like?
A wall of virtual meetings, which I'm sure many people relate to. I'm curious what your calendar looks like too, Rachel.
Yeah,
I think
same.
I would say that probably no 2 days feel typical. I think every day is a little bit different. I try to think more about how am I going to plan out my weeks. If I'm lucky, I'm spending like 40% of my time doing something that resembles some sort of strategic work, and working with other design leaders across the organization, both at peer levels as well as upward. That's not always, I don't always get so lucky. And obviously that depends so greatly on what the maturity is of the team that you're working with. Where you're a team of one, I would say that's really, really, really hard to play something that looks like a strategic role. You oftentimes end up having to do all of the things for all of the people. As you start to get a team that is working with you, for you, then you start to have more opportunities to lean into more of the upstream into the strategy work, which is great. That's definitely the space that I like to play in. I also try to spend a lot of my time in a given week with my team. So because I'm a manager of a team and my team's in the sort of 12 to 15 person range, a lot of my time personally goes to developing my team, coaching them, helping them troubleshoot things, getting things out of their way, looking at priorities, looking at annual and quarterly planning, those sorts of things. I spend a lot of my time in just cross-functional meetings, whether that's with, mostly in my case, it's like products across the, cross-functional partners across the business that are in the support functions, as some people think of them. So these are the finance teams, the IT teams, the HR teams, the recruitment teams, some of the back of house functions. And that's showing up and being an ambassador for what are the needs of the design team. How can we flow through if there's programming that's coming out at a corporate level, or there organizational things that we need to think about, how does that roll out for design? What are the things that we need to say no to as a design organization? What are the things that don't make sense for us to do? And having conversations at that level. And then the other thing is like operational type stuff. So resolving escalations, monitoring issues, checking in on progress, how are we doing against our OKRs, and so forth.
All of that. Yeah, I would say just like the kinds of buckets of things that I often do is like, I'll just kind of go through them, but there's many things that kind of can come and go during a normal day. There's not necessarily a normal day, but so our team manages kind of a lot of the communications at various levels. So we have like newsletters we send out, we do status reports, quarterly business reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So I say comms is a huge one. So we have a whole communication calendar that my team manages that's just about communicating to the UX org. Tools, workflow, and processes. So all of the things around managing the workflow, and at Salesforce we use Agile. So I don't personally manage the workings of the teams anymore. I'm a higher level at Zoom, right? But my team does. So helping them just like create best practices around work tracking and project management and all of that. My team is very heavily involved in team growth and learning. So we design programs for the UX org to just really up levels. We have different like knowledge sharing events and bring in speakers and all of that. So we manage different trainings, et cetera, for our team to grow. We also do a lot of like connection and community building with our external communities. So our team manages like how we show up externally, like the voice of UX in our blogs, how we participate in external events. Our team is really like the glue that helps people even know about how to participate in all these kinds of events and things. We also own like recognition of our team members, team health programs, all of that. So kind of community and culture building is a big one. And then like Lindsay mentioned, partnerships really with like all kinds of folks out in the organization, recruiting, facilities, finance, HR, legal, like the list goes on, but our team is kind of the central connector between our UX and a lot of those teams. And then like a lot of that guidelines and governance stuff that we just kind of try to keep updated and help people stay, budget policies, travel policies, which are not so relevant right now, but templates, et cetera. Like we have a whole resource center for our UX team that we keep updated with best practices for how they do the work itself too.
Perfect, that's really interesting. Thank you both. So the next sort of thing that I think a lot of people are probably wondering about is how do you actually get into design ops? Like what kind of skills are transferable? What kind of what things are hiring managers looking for and that kind of thing?
Do you want me to start, Lindsay? So I can start. So
I muted myself and then I couldn't figure out how to unmute. I'm good now, but go ahead.
So like I think design operations is a unique design practice in that there is no traditional path to it. There's not like a program you graduate from that's like the design ops program that like we all look to say like, oh, that's a great program, I want to hire from there. So the paths for people who end up in design ops are varied, and I think that's amazing, and it's a great thing that we have all these different skills that we bring to the table in design ops. And so was your question specifically around the interviews itself, or like the skills that we look for, or like where should we focus this specific question?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think probably initially is just like what the skills are you looking for, rather than like the nitty-gritty of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So because it is design ops, I really do look for people that understand design. So that doesn't mean that they have to have been designers, or that they have to have worked a long time with design teams, but do they understand the process of design, what the value is, and how we work? So that could be a combination of, if you're transitioning into this kind of role, like self-learning, self-education, volunteer work, like really, I like that. It's a part that I think is needed, just because there is a steep learning curve if you don't have design knowledge, but it could come from a lot of different places. I'm not just looking for designers or some. I'm not an actual designer, but I have a very strong understanding of design. And then there's like all these other things around, like I look for like people that are able to like connect dots and being able to think at various levels of zoom. So can you zoom into the details and really problem solve around very specific stuff, but then zoom back out and understand how it fits into the bigger picture? Communication, like I mentioned, are you great at communicating verbally, written, all of that? Presenting, problem solving, like our whole job is problem solving. So if you have examples of solving big problems, identifying gaps, and then creating solutions around that in any kind of, it could be, it doesn't have to be design related again, you could be doing that in healthcare or in whatever, all kinds of different spaces. But the kind of piece that I'm looking for is, did you identify a gap in a process or how people were working, that then you created a solution for it? So design something to help solve that, and then you can kind of show the impact that had. Able to kind of take ideas and bring them into action. So not just kind of coming up with an idea, but how do you actually follow through, bring people along with you, get buy-in, communicate, roll out, like the whole end-to-end process of idea through action. And then just like this leadership quality of like being able to kind of be partners with leadership. You have a strong kind of confidence around how you approach a problem. And you may not have solved every problem, because you won't, but you understand how to do that and kind of what needs to be done in an organization to make that happen. So those are just some off the top of my head, but Lindsay, I'd love to hear what you think.
Just a couple of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, what you said definitely resonated. I look for a lot of those same things too in candidates, which, even in through the UX coffee hours, the mentorship sessions that I've been having, I spent a lot of time talking about these sorts of things of like, what are hiring managers looking for? What should I put in my portfolio? Wait, what? I have to create a portfolio? And I think that's sort of the first thing that might be surprising for folks, is even thinking about how do you frame up the experiences that you've had professionally so that it is appealing to hiring managers that are hiring for these roles. And some of that, because this sits usually within a design organization, although there are many other ops, design ops sister functions, they're marketing ops and creative ops and so on, and all the ops. But I think the thing in common is like, how do you weave together your project examples in a way that tells a story around how do you approach problem solving, and how do you bring people along, how do you manage something that's really large and complex, everything from soup to nuts, and the role that you've played in that, and whether that's you have done that yourself or you've partnered with other people. I think it's sort of looking back at your own project experience, even if you didn't necessarily think of it as project or program management or ops experience. I think there's ways that you can frame that experience that you have to make it resonate and feel relevant to your interviewing team. But yeah, I do definitely look for people who've had experience doing everything from like setting up a project. You've written project briefs. If you've been on the consulting side, you've kind of been through the hoops of actually defining what a scope is. You've set up budgets. You've managed large project budgets, and so you have some really strong business acumen, and you understand that design also costs money, and whether that's in terms of resources or headcount, managing outside budgets, whether it's contractors or working with other agencies. And you've kind of had that experience of being on the other side is actually quite valuable. And so even if you are looking at roles in-house, if you have that rich consulting experience, it oftentimes is very translatable. So what Rachel said, I would say absolutely. I look for experience of folks that have worked with creative professionals. It doesn't necessarily need to be like I've worked with product design teams. But I think the fact that if you work in the trenches with other designers and creative professionals, and it positions you in a way to have empathy for how the work needs to get done, and how to partner with people to help them get their work done easier, faster, more efficiently. Communication, I oftentimes even like when I bring new people in, I sort of reset the expectation that like, hey, let's remember that like 80% of our job is communication at least. And so we have to do that really well, and it's got to be really buttoned up, and that's in presentations with leaders, it's in written communication, it's having an actual like approach to how you're going to manage change with stakeholders, because change is inevitable. Like, what are the examples in which you've done that? And then I also, particularly because so much of these, the work these teams are doing is ground up, looking for people that have experience having built something from scratch is actually something I find kind of critically important. It's like they've gone into a space where nothing existed, and they kind of were able to be scrappy and make do with the resources that they had available to them at the moment that they were there, and that they're nimble enough to build a solution potentially that may not be the best solution ultimately for all time, but it's the thing that works for right now. And so somebody who can kind of flex their approach to what the current needs are of the business.
Oh, thank you. That was detailed answers from both of you. Thanks so much. I think probably what's a good idea now is just to have a look at some of the questions we've got, because I think a lot of them touch on the theme we've just been discussing. So I see one question in the chat here from Mark. Kind of touched upon this, but what does a design ops or program manager portfolio look like for hiring managers? Like what actually, what kind of material do you have to hand over?
So I can share what I asked for. I have like a very detailed overview of what we like people to share when we have interviews, and I can drop a link to this at the end. But I created kind of an overview of Design Ops 101, but it includes a section around Design Ops interview guide for my mentees that I can share with you all at the end. But so for our portfolio interviews, and this is similar to what I did when I was leading Design Ops at Uber Eats, Capital One, and here at Salesforce. So I'd say like generally this might be kind of similar, but it of course will change a little bit depending on where you're interviewing. But so usually the portfolio presentation is about 40 minutes or so, and I ask for two kinds of project examples. So those are like case studies, and usually the two are around specific themes, and it's changed a little bit depending on where I'm, what the role is for, but oftentimes the theme is showing something that's process related. So how did you, like I mentioned before, identify a gap in a process and then create a solution and show like the whole the process you took and then the end result. And then the second portfolio example is sometimes around sharing a people or culture building initiative, or depending on if that's the focus of the role, or maybe it's something around very specific, like a design product that you participated in launching. So depending on the role, but basically it's we usually ask for two different case studies. But what I really love to see is like a full narrative of those case studies. So setting the scene, showing what role you played, who's involved, what are the different players basically in that scene, framing the problem. So what was going wrong, what was not working, then how did you solve the problem? So what approach did you take? How did it go? What obstacles did you encounter? And then what was the solution you came up with? And then finally, like, what were the outcomes, what did you learn, and then of course like wrapping it all up and talking about the impact you made. So I do encourage people to kind of use that storytelling arc in their presentation format. Outside of the like the 2 case studies, I often just like to ask people to share some additional stuff at the front part of the presentation, which is a bit more about them and their career, like briefly, like their experience. I like to ask people what their definition of design ops is, or what the value is. So come to me with your overview of design ops so I can see how you think about it as it fits into the organization, what it means for the organization. And then, yeah, that's kind of the general like overview. And then I also do pay attention to how people are presenting the work. So it like paying attention to the deck you're sharing, like this is an example of how you might present work to the whole organization when you're rolling out a program. So I don't, encourage just like a very bland with bullets, like show me things, show me how you organize data, show me process charts, show me, even if you can't show the work itself, show me, you can blur out like the actual data, but like what is the tracking tool you've created, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, I would +1 to all of those things. It seems like we follow a similar interviewing tips for folks that we're interviewing for our teams too. I definitely do. I think it can be a little bit daunting to know that the visual aesthetics of your presentation is sometimes, especially if designers are going to be in your interview loop, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking to know that, wait a minute, I have to prepare a portfolio presentation that's as visually appealing as any designer that's walking in the room. I would say, if you have designers who are friends, who are willing to help out, I think also in like kind of doing a view over and giving us some input, I think on the visual aesthetics of your presentation is definitely something I would recommend as well. The storyline, definitely +1 on that. Like what is the storyline? Even thinking through like being okay and comfortable with talking about the things that didn't go very well. One of the things that I see interviewees kind of struggle with is admitting that something didn't go so great, and talking about like how they would do something differently next time if they could have changed X, Y, or Z, which actually shows me that that's kind of like real life scenario. There's rarely a moment where something that you put forth in your working world, whatever your profession is like exactly going to be the right thing every time out of the gates. And I think hiring managers are definitely looking for people that bring that sense of humbleness into their work. The other thing I'm thinking about, and Rachel, you touched on this too, I think the quantity of things that you're bringing in, sometimes particularly, and this is I think true for a lot of us that have come from very generalist backgrounds, it can be very tempting to pile into your portfolio like 1,000 different things that you work on. And so being very mindful, what is the specific scope of this role that you're interviewing for, right? So like if you're coming in to interview for a program manager or ops role that's focused on learning and development programs, maybe you should tailor your projects that you're showing in your portfolio to that specific type of program, as opposed to like, and I've worked on all these other 80,000 types of projects. So keeping it focused in that way. Metrics comes up a lot in conversations too. Like how do we quantify, how do we size the impact of the work that we're doing? It's also kind of hard, but sometimes if you think about metrics, not just in the things that can be quantified, so then they may be numbers based, they may not be, but what is even like qualitative feedback that you've gotten for people who have been the benefit of some of the programs, projects that you've worked with, or that where they've seen value, and playing that back can also be helpful.
Great, thank you both. Do you have something else to say on that point, Rachel?
I was just gonna add that in a lot of the mentoring sessions I've had with people who are thinking about transitioning, who haven't done ops before, the idea of having to share like how do I even frame an ops problem, like has like been a bit of bit intimidating, it seems like, for people. But I would just say like, no matter what role you're transitioning from, if you've been in ops, then you have a design ops story to tell, because you can just use the design process and lens to tell it. Or two, if you're in design and you're transitioning into ops, then you can use that design process to tell the ops story. So like I would not be like intimidated by it, because there's so many stories you can tell. It's just about framing it in the right way, like either using ops or adding design if you have to if you're doing that transition, just adding those two pieces in.
Great, thank you. That's perfect. There are a couple of questions on this theme. So I think this is also relevant to Google too, right? Like, how is design ops different from program manager roles?
Do you want me to go first, Rachel? So I think my lens is that I've had ops teams that have had a number of different focuses in organizations that I've worked in. And so my perspective on ops is that it's more of a collective of people of which some portion of those folks might be program management or program managers in their scope. They might also be research coordinators. They might also be business analysts. They might be any number of different types of flavors of design ops. And so I feel like design ops for me is really kind of all encompassing of all of those things that help to service the design organization at large. I don't know, Rachel, if you have a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally in line with what I've found too. I think that there's the way that I've often thought about design ops is that there's multiple levels of Zoom. So there might be project level, and those could be like design producers, UX producers, project managers, but it's really about partnering with a lead designer and managing like a project level work. And then the next level up is program level, which is, you find design program managers, UX program managers, and that's about partnering with like maybe a design manager who's looking across multiple, whole product line or something, and you're helping to really run the ops of that team. And then at the like another level might be like portfolio level or practice level or something like that, where you're looking across an entire design practice. So I think like the terminology is still being like worked out. Like we're not all like aligned on whether it's UX ops, design program management. Like you'll just kind of see all those names, but the general, it might signal a level of Zoom, not necessarily a level of seniority, but a level of Zoom, like what your sphere of control or your what you're looking over. So yeah, I would say program management is part of design ops if you're at that level of Zoom that you're looking over a program, doing ops for that program.
There's also an extent.
That's interesting. I've had even, sorry, I was just going to add that it's interesting because I think there's also this interesting wave perhaps of thinking about how do we in title or job profiles even think about creating that synergy between the different roles, like whether you're a program manager who's focused in product development, right? You're, to Rachel's point, working with a design manager, or you're a program manager who's looking after building and maintaining and keeping fresh and evolving programs around the employee journey and employee experience. Or you're even a program manager who's focused on like research tools, right? It's like, do we have the right research tools to help to enable our research getting done by our research team? And I think any of those things can be programs. So it really is sort of like, what is the thing that you have a particular passion about, and trying to align the roles that you're going after to map to that is another thing to consider in your searches.
That kind of overlaps nicely with the question I was going to ask, actually, which is from Helen. Does your role cross over with research ops?
With research ops?
Yeah.
I can quickly answer that. So my role has crossed over with research ops in the past. It doesn't right now, but I think it's mostly dependent on how the org is structured. So at Uber, for example, on Uber Eats, research rolled up through design. So so did content UX writing. Sorry. So my purview was all of those disciplines: design, research, and UX writing. At Salesforce, research is outside of design. It's its own separate group, and so I don't manage research ops now. But so it depends on the organization. I think how it's structured, what it's called, etc. Like whether or not research has been within my purview, but it 100% can be depending on the team structure.
I've managed research operations teams as part of my larger design ops purview at my last couple of companies. Not currently any longer because we don't have a dedicated research team in my group at Apple. So I'm not currently managing that, but I think in the places where, in the organizations where I have managed those teams, there are oftentimes a lot more synergies in ops people to ops people as opposed to research ops even having a desired career path into becoming a researcher. And so a lot of times that was partly the reason that instigated research ops is coming under the larger ops umbrella. Both from a hiring perspective, are we hiring the right types of people that have the right skills that we need to do this job effectively? And people who come from an ops program project producer background are much more likely to be able to assess the caliber of the talent coming in the door, as well as to be able to onboard those folks effectively to do their jobs well, because they're much more on the sort of programmatic operational systems tooling side, as opposed to the design and research methodology. And then sort of ongoing development too. And I think partly that's just like having people get exposure to the different types of ops and program management work that can exist across an organization. Whereas if you keep research ops separate, the tendency is that you just are seeing sort of research portions of projects as opposed to the entirety of the end-to-end product or service or ecosystem development. So I think there's real value in bringing those teams together. Not every organization has done that, particularly to Rachel's point where you have research living outside of the design function. But where those two things kind of live under one overarching VP, SVP, and so forth, those are also really interesting spaces to play.
Thank you, that's really interesting. So there's a couple of kind of more thoughtful questions here. So the first one is, at what point did you know that design ops was what you wanted to do? So maybe Lindsay, since you're off mute, you can go first on this one.
When did I know what I wanted to be when I grow up? I'm not sure that I know yet, and I'm in my 40s. I'm still trying to figure that out. I think for me, there's something that is appealing to it in the fact that all of the answers aren't figured out. As much as it can be really anxiety provoking to go into a role where there isn't this like perfect playbook of how, thousands of people before you did the same exact job. That's also part of the intrigue of it. And I think because I'm a natural, I like to take things apart and try to put them back together. I love just the organizational aspects. Funny anecdote, even as a small child in the grocery store, I used to be that annoying kid who would like reorganize the gum and candy rack at the checkout. Every time I was in a grocery store, of course, it drove my mother crazy. But I think those were like early indicators that I was drawn to do something that resembled like organizing things. And in my case, it's organizing people. So I think there's this really nice intersection between that desire, my psychology studies and working with people, which I also at the time never realized that would be a springboard into working in sort of a services type of profession. And so I think that's, yeah, I think in the last, even since we started calling design ops a thing in industry and just finding that there's so many other people, that you're not an island, you're not, a lonely person on an island trying to do this job, that there's lots of folks to tap into. It's really helped to build this community around design ops. And I think just by virtue of being part of and giving back to that community, there's this like, it's just this continued loop of like, you learn something, you give it back, you learn something, you give it back. And I think there's something really inspiring about working with a group of people that are equally invested in that.
Yeah, I love that. What about yourself, Rachel?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's taken like the evolution of design ops for me to really start to know that this is my place and these are my people and this is what I want to be doing, because in the beginning, before it was very defined, it's not very defined yet, but before it was even to where it is now, I did have a moment where I was like, do I go down this path or do I go down the designer path? Because I really wanted to be part of the strategy around products and services, and I really wanted to be in the work and not just the person managing the work or like the admin part of it. And I think that for me, it was only because I was not, the role I was in wasn't well understood and I wasn't brought in the way that I wanted to be. So really I had to start creating my own version of this role of what design ops is, that it's a strategic role, that I'm part of the work, that I'm part of creating the vision for all of this, and that I'm part of the team. I'm not this like layer of ops that just sits on top, that like we are the fabric of the work and of the people. And so once I started to really like show up on my teams and say, hey, I'm part of this team. I'm not just going to ask you if you're doing your work or not. Like I'm going to think through this problem with you. I'm going to like work with you on this. And then I started seeing that change in how I was being brought in and how I was being viewed, and like what opportunities became available. And then I started to really feel like, okay, this is the kind of role. But until I like made that decision to operate differently myself and not just kind of be the project manager, I think I was on the fence of like whether or not this world is the right place for me. But it is now. Like I see myself as a, like I mentioned in the very beginning, like this is a design role. I'm just designing systems and processes, and I'm helping people, you know, really like create experiences and environment that they can really thrive in as designers. And so like there's a lot of I don't know, there's a lot of like, it feels good to do that kind of work where you're helping both like the end result of the product be better and helping people enjoy the work better. So I do see the impact of what I do now.
That's lovely, thank you. So I've got quite an interesting question in the chat. Maybe you need a second to think about, but might be interesting. What do you think? Do you think you can share a moment when you actually experienced a failure during your career? So let's call it a challenge. So some kind of challenge that you experienced in your design ops career and how you kind of learned from that. I'm not sure who likes to go first on this one.
Thinking of a fun example. So many to choose from. Maybe one thing I could share, which is particularly for folks that have been in consulting for some time and they're thinking about how do they transition into working in-house. One of the challenges that I experienced in coming from that environment into in-house, where people are let's say, not so welcoming to this, like, hey, okay, I'm gonna go take your requirements and then I'm gonna go away for 3 weeks or a phase at a time, and then I'm gonna come back to you with this like perfectly finished product, program, experience, whatever the thing is. It doesn't work that way, and I think I learned that lesson pretty quickly. But folks needed to be brought along on the journey, and I had been used to doing that working on in consulting, of managing those expectations with clients, but taking the client out of the picture, it was a little bit of a bumpy road, I would say, for me to get to learn to do that differently inside an organization where, you know, I need to partner much more closely with those people. I can't just like go away for 2 weeks and come back with a shiny presentation and think that I've done all the work and it's done. And that sort of also leads into this, like, really changing my own mindset, that I had to learn that there isn't really this concept of done. You're never really done with anything that you're working on, I have found in design ops. And I think that was something, especially as like, again, coming from consulting, where you're like, you wrap up a project and you give your deliverables to your client and then you're like, okay, on to the next one. That concept in-house definitely does not exist. So that was definitely a hard lesson learned.
I had to learn that lesson the hard way also. I think for me, so like early on, I think in ops, in my career in ops, I like would often try to do everything myself. So like if I was an owner of a program, I would think like I have to be the one to do every little piece and communicate it out and get buy-in and go to every single team and say, hey, do this thing, here's how you do it. Like, but I learned, I think I actually, like the light bulb went off when I went to a change management workshop and I like learned this new process. But basically like my big takeaway there was like, there are already people in the organization that have a lot of influence and people listen to them and like utilize them. So like I, didn't, for an example, I did not like do a great rollout of this new tracking tool early, like for some team I was on, right? Like people didn't want to change from like those tools they were already using, and like, why do I have to change? Like you're just telling me to use this new thing, but whatever. And I was just trying to like, oh, but it's this new one. Everyone's like going to move over to it. But the better approach would have been to utilize the managers of each of those teams to say, hey, like get them to buy in and then get them to amplify and be the champion of it. And so I have been kind of much better at realizing that like it is actually not my role to get everyone to buy into a new thing, like to do that behavior change. It's my role to define the thing and then help facilitate that happening, but utilize the people in the organization to help with a lot of these programs, because so much of what we do is about behavior change. So getting used to doing that is a big help for sure.
Perfect, thank you. So we've got about 10 minutes left. There was a final theme that we were going to discuss, and there's also some questions on this. I think it's worth just trying to fit this in if we can. So it's around what a design ops role might look like in the future in terms of the career trajectory, and what other things it might unlock. Again, up to you who goes first on this one. It's maybe a tricky one to explain.
I can start. So I think like there's a lot of opportunity here. At Salesforce, I think our ops team is pretty mature, and so we've already started to think about what the future of UX might look like, and we have reorganized our UX org into two discrete practices, which is team ops and product ops. So we have now specialists who focus on the product, so all the things of running the product. They're vertical teams, and then we have horizontals that's my team, and we're really focusing on scaling and amplifying and the people side of it. So like the support layer that for the whole UX org. And what I'm finding is that specifically that horizontal org, which is around like all programs to help our team, is actually the value of it goes well beyond design or UX. So I see like the future of design ops to not necessarily be just for design. Like so much of what we do is can help all legs of the stool. And like, what does it look like when design is actually an even leg to product and eng? Then like maybe UX ops is that layer on top, and we're actually helping those three teams function and run even better. The other piece of this is that as design ops teams grow, like we're less and less having to argue for headcount for just like that one person to help us. Like now we have bigger teams, and what that means is we're able to start to specialize. So what could it look like if there were the future of design ops? There were very specific tracks where people could start to like, I'm the event specialist, or I'm the scale, or like there's like so many different tracks that it could take because there's so many parts of our work. But maybe the future is less about being generalists, which are still useful, but like to really up-level all of design ops, we might start to have really specific specialists within design ops. So I think there's two parts. One is the value of our work getting utilized more broadly at higher levels of Zoom, and then just like across more teams than design, and then possibly more specialization in the things we do.
Oh, my cat wants to say hi. Come here. Come say hi to friends. Coco says hi to all our friends online. I think that's a really interesting thing that you mentioned, Rachel, because where a lot of these design ops teams have sprung up, I've found that in many cases, those same organizations don't necessarily have an ops function that is supporting the other disciplines that design is working with, right? So product management in orgs that I've worked in hasn't had, up until the one that I'm in now, hasn't had a related or sister ops function that is looking after the needs of product management, which in many cases, just as much as like engineering needs are different from design teams, product management needs are very different too. And I think that's a space, particularly for folks that are maybe product management curious, that could be one way to think about how do you take these things that you're learning in a design ops role and parlay them into things that are in other disciplines. And I think it's further expanding the value that design ops can bring, that it's not just about like design ops, it's really about all of the people that are part of making experiences for customers. I think there's also, I've seen people transition between design management and design operations, and what does that look like? I think design managers might have a proclivity to focus more on things that are like talent programs or learning programs. I think I've seen people sort of transition into ops that way, and also from ops into the other direction, that have worked entrenched in partnership with design managers who have sort of like raised an idea of like, hey, wait a minute, I could actually go and do design management. I think same things where people who are leading design ops teams. I think that the management structure, and again to Rachel's point about specialties, having groups of people doing like things and then creating opportunities for people to move into management roles that cover across those different specialties. Access to other functions across the organization. So if you're looking after relationships and partnerships with IT and finance and HR and recruiting and corporate learning and development teams, you might find through the process of doing program management with the lens being on doing that for your design team, that actually gives you exposure to things that are happening on a corporate level. And so you might actually be able to like create those connections and create opportunities to move into something that resembles a role more in one of those spaces. Chief of staff was another thing that come up. I know our friend Tim is on the call here. Other folks who are ops and chief of staff in one role. I think the availability of those types of roles is also becoming more and more present, at least in the organizations where I've worked at, where you become this right hand to a person who is running an organization. And many teams and many organizations now at that VP level are actively seeking chief of staff like roles. And so I think depending on your position and the things that you're interested in, that could also be another door that this working in the design ops space unlocks for you.
Wow, cool. So good news anyway. So we've got 3 minutes left. I'm going to pick which I think is a nice question to end on from the chat there. What's your favorite thing about your job? Again, I'll let you pick who has the best idea first.
Go, Rachel, go.
I think I kind of touched on it before, but I do feel like I've found this role that just like matches my interests, which is really about like designing programs and processes and things for teams, and really being able to see the impact of that in the products we turn out and how people are feeling on the teams. It's really like it just feels like a great fit. And then Lindsay, I think you mentioned this before, but like the design ops community is super strong, and it's just it's a great group of people, and I really love just being a part of it.
Yeah, I would echo the sentiment around the people and the community, probably first and foremost. I think I referred to it earlier as like feeling like it's my tribe. So definitely when in a world in which we are all working remotely and over WebEx, to feel like you actually have that tribe that you feel this intense sense of belonging with is wonderful. Because that also goes back, especially if you're a team of one, thinking about like, how do I solve these problems? Like knowing you have people to solve problems with is actually really a wonderful thing to tap into. And I think it also appeals to the fact that so much of it is undone, and we're so early in the maturity of this, and that I get to play a role in defining what that looks like, not just for my own organization, but for the community at large, and how design operations kind of grows and scales and evolves in industry, and getting to be part of that is a really fun journey.
That's lovely. That's a really nice way to finish off, actually. So we're out of time. Thank you so much, Rachel and Lindsay. That was really, really detailed, really interesting. And we had lots and lots of questions, so thank you for going through those and answering those with us as well. That's the end, but if there's anything else you want to say to close off, please feel free. Otherwise,
I'll just say I just dropped a link to the what I'm calling the Design Ops Pocket Guide, and there's a section at the end about what I look for in interviewing, but hopefully it's a good just intro to design ops if you're new to it. So please take a a look there, and also just reach out on LinkedIn or whatever if you want to chat more.
Likewise. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Courtney, for organizing this, and thank you, Rachel, for inviting me to join you and suggesting it.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.